Hey, welcome back to Homeschool Wherever. My name is Sognonvi, and in today's video, we are going to take a look at the pros and cons of homeschool versus public school. So we have two daughters, one in 3rd grade and one in 6th grade, and up until this year, they have been in public school their whole lives. And for us, public school was not a negative experience, so I definitely have a lot of insight I can bring into the pros and cons of each. If you're new to this channel, we are a multiracial secular family living in New York City, and we are starting homeschooling for the very first time this year. This channel is all about documenting that journey, so if that sounds of interest to you, I hope you'll subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next video. Also, we are full-time family travel creators, so if you want to check out that side of our lives, go check out our travel channel at Top Flight Family. So the first pro is shorter school days. So when kids go to public school, they're in school usually from 8 a.m. to about 3 p.m. So it's a really long day. But if you break down the amount of time they actually spend doing work and studying, it is a fraction of that. So the great thing about homeschooling is you take away all that wasted time. So think about all the time that's sucked up by taking attendance, when there's disciplinary issues, a teacher having to discipline a student, all the time that it takes for kids just to hang up their book bags and get settled and get their work out. So when you homeschool, you get rid of all of that, which means that you can work much more efficiently. Most homeschooling families, depending on the age of their kids, of course, will homeschool anywhere from like 1 to just 3 or 4 hours per day, which leaves the rest of the day for fun and free time and play. A con of homeschool, though, is no childcare. For a lot of working parents, school is not just about education. Sending their kids to school also means that they're sending their kids to childcare. And during the pandemic, it became obvious how much working parents really rely on the school system to provide the childcare needed so that they can actually have time to labor at their jobs, or even if they're working from home already, they still need that time to do that work. So one con of homeschool is that it definitely takes time away from you. So if you're a homemaker, you may not have the same blocks of time that you needed before to get your housework done or run errands. And if you work outside the home, you're gonna have less time to dedicate to your job, or you're gonna have to fit your job around homeschooling. Now, the beauty, of course, of homeschooling is that it's so flexible that you can structure your time in whatever way works best for your family. So believe it or not, there are homeschooling families where parents work full-time, but they do all of their homeschooling just on the weekends, for example. So in our family, I work full-time running my business, and so basically I try to focus all of the homeschooling on 3 days a week so that the other 2 days I can spend at the office. Now, during those 2 days, the girls are still doing stuff, but I don't have to be so actively involved. Now, one big pro of homeschooling is that you get to spend more time with your kids. Obviously, that's one of the greatest benefits, is being able to spend so much quality time together and really getting to know your kids and how they learn, and that's just really valuable. The con of that is no breaks from one another. Obviously, with homeschooling, you have less time away from each other, and sometimes we need that, right? As parents, we need it. Kids need breaks from us. So that can be a little bit challenging sometimes. However, I feel like after this quarantine period, I think most families have learned to really value that togetherness and to find ways to make it work, or to kind of create those pockets of solitude when they need it. So personally, this is a con that I'm not too concerned about. A pro of homeschool is bringing learning to life. One of the things that I love about homeschooling so far is the ability to create experiences for my kids to really bring what we're learning to life. So whether that's by doing hands-on activities or science experiments or doing field trips or doing actual trips through our travels, that's just been really invaluable. The con of that is it can get expensive. It can definitely be easy to get carried away when you homeschool and wanting to do every single field trip and let's go to this museum and that museum. Now, you do have to keep your budget in mind, because if you do all the things, it's gonna get expensive. But as long as you're conscious of it and have a bit of a plan, it shouldn't be such an issue. Another pro of homeschool is no more teaching to the test. Now, I can't speak for other parts of the country, but I know here in New York City, one of the frustrations that a lot of parents have with our public school system is the way the system is so focused on standardized testing. Now, we were actually fortunate to have our girls in a school that wasn't really that way. Of course, they did do standardized testing because it's mandated by the state. However, they didn't really focus that much time on test prep. I mean, they definitely did some test prep, but it wasn't like some schools where the entire year is essentially spent prepping for this big exam. So that kind of approach can create a lot of pressure on kids. It can cause a lot of anxiety. And when you homeschool, you don't have to do any of that. I mean, if you choose to be a very heavy testing culture in your homeschool, that's great. You can, go for it. But I think that most homeschooling families prefer to take a much more relaxed approach. So you definitely take that element out of education. Now, the con of homeschooling is that you miss out on the experience of great great teachers. Now, there is an attitude I have noticed sometimes in certain homeschooling communities where there's a little bit of disdain towards public school or private school teachers. You know, this idea that, oh, they're not the only ones who know how to educate our kids. I know how to educate my kids. And yes, absolutely, you know how to educate your kids. That's the whole reason you're homeschooling. However, I don't really agree that there is no value in what teachers do. My mom was a teacher. Serge is a teacher, not in public school, but he teaches karate. And teaching is a skill. It's not something that anybody knows how to do. And obviously, teachers in public schools go to school specifically to learn how to teach. So that's not to say that kids in homeschools are worse off than kids in public schools. But let's be real, there are some amazing teachers out there. And if you're homeschooling, then you're not necessarily going to gain the benefit of their skills and experience. Again, it's not necessarily a problem, but I do feel like there is intrinsically a value to good teachers. And that is definitely a pro of public school, is that your kids can be exposed to some of those amazing teachers. Now, a big pro of homeschooling is working at your own pace. So one thing that is not great about public schools is that it is a one-size-fits-all system by necessity. So if one teacher is handling a classroom of 20 to 30 kids, there's no way that they can tailor their teaching to the needs of every single child. However, with homeschooling, you can do that. So if there's an area where your kid needs a lot of help, you can slow down the pace and take the time you need to really master something. And conversely, if there's another area in which your kid is just zipping through the material, you can let them go and do it fast. You don't have to insist that they take a whole month to study a subject if they zip through that thing in a week. And then homeschooling also allows kids to do deep dives into subjects that they're really interested in. So if your kid has a passion for dinosaurs or baking or whatever it is, you have the time to allow that child to explore their interest in a really deep and really meaningful way. Now, a con of homeschooling is you will be judged. I think there is definitely much less stigma around homeschooling compared to, let's say a decade ago, and particularly after COVID. I think a lot of families are taking a completely different look at homeschooling. However, that said, people are going to be people, and people may judge you for the choices that you're making in education for your kids. Now, obviously tied up with that is often a lack of understanding of what homeschooling actually is. But I definitely have noticed that when I talk to different people about the fact that we homeschool, their reactions are mixed. It's not always going to be overwhelmingly positive. And sometimes that can obviously rub off on you, where you're like, wow, did I make the right choice? Am I totally screwing up my kids? So it's a reality that judgment and doubt are always going to kind of be there in the background, and some days not in the background at all, but in the foreground. Now, a great pro of homeschooling is you can school anywhere. And obviously that's the idea behind the title of this channel, which is Homeschool Wherever, because even though we're based in New York City, we travel a lot because we're full-time family travel creators. And so for us, homeschooling doesn't always just happen in the home. Oftentimes it can happen in a whole other country because we're on a trip. Now, a con of homeschooling is that it can be a thankless job. This is no different than what teachers experience in public schools or private schools, charter schools. As a teacher, you are not always going to be appreciated. Yes, some days you're going to have those amazing days where your kids are so engaged and they love it and they're so happy that we're homeschooling. And then other days, they're just not going to be in the mood, they're not going to be feeling it, and they're going to be rolling their eyes and just not appreciating your efforts at all. So it's definitely important to come into it with an open mind and realize that, hey, not every day is going to be this magical day of learning where they're so grateful to you, mom or dad, for homeschooling them. It's real life. Sometimes it's going to feel thankless, and it's just something to be prepared for. Another pro of homeschool is that you get to avoid social toxicity. And what I mean by this are the things that can cause our kids emotional turmoil that come from their peers. So things like bullying, things like mean girls behavior, things like peer pressure, social ostracization. When you take your kids out of public school, you don't have to worry about any of that because you're really creating an environment in your home that won't have any of those elements. Now, one con of homeschool is that socialization needs to be deliberate. Now, there are still people who have a lot of preconceived notions about homeschooling and they feel like kids are never going to be socialized. And this is something that is super annoying for homeschooling families, because you'll often hear homeschooling parents say that, if anything, my kid is over-socialized because we do all of these different activities and classes and group field trips and co-ops. So no, homeschooling doesn't mean that your kid is not going to be socialized. However, it does mean that any socialization that happens outside of your home needs to be kind of deliberate and planned. So when my girls were in public school, I didn't have to do any planning for them to socialize. All I did was send them off to school, and then they're among a bunch of other kids and they get all their socializing done. It's not something that I have to go out and seek or plan or enroll them in classes or join co-ops. It's something that happens automatically. But if you're homeschooling, especially for us since we started homeschooling during a pandemic, there isn't necessarily that built-in socialization. There does require a little bit of planning, a little bit of outreach. And I have to say that one thing I am a bit concerned about as a new homeschooling parent myself is not socialization itself, but my girls' abilities to carry on long-term relationships. Because that's one thing that can be pretty great about keeping your kids in public school, assuming that they're in the same school throughout. Because Sean, for instance, was in the same school from K all the way through 5th grade, and she has friendships that have lasted all of those years. And then conversely, she also has friendships that have kind of gone up and down over time, which I also think is a valuable thing in terms of life skills, to have longer term relationships and understand that they kind of ebb and flow and that personalities change or people change over time, circumstances change. So I do wonder if through homeschooling they will be able to sustain those kinds of long-term relationships with kids that we meet through the homeschooling community, especially because New York is a little bit of a transitional place. So we'll see. If at a later point you decide to re-enroll your child in public school or any other kind of school, some kids may struggle a little bit on the socialization front. Now, many kids who are homeschooled actually thrive when they go back to a regular school. So it's definitely not the case that no homeschool kid is ever going to be able to hack a regular school. But some kids do struggle with that transition, so it's just something to be aware of. Another pro of homeschool is that you can avoid certain physical dangers. Now, I already talked about how homeschooling kind of opts you out a little bit of that social toxicity, but unfortunately in public schools, it's not just emotional harm that can be done. Unfortunately, sometimes it can be physical harm. So things like school shootings, maybe teachers or authority figures that are engaging in grooming behavior. This type of stuff is not necessarily widespread among all public schools, but that danger definitely exists out there. Now, things can happen anywhere, so it doesn't mean that if you homeschool your kids, you completely eliminate the possibility of any physical danger ever happening to them. That is definitely not a reality. But it's definitely less likely that those specific things that can happen in a school context will happen at home. Now, a con of homeschool is that kids may lack perspective. Now, this is kind of a touchy subject because it's kind of a pro and a con at the same time, depending on your perspective. Because as parents, we get to shape the homeschool in the way that we want our kids to be educated, it means that there's going to be a clear point of view, which usually reflects our worldview. So if you've watched any of my other videos, like the one about why we homeschool or our homeschool curriculum choices, you'll know that one of the things about our family is that we're definitely progressive, kind of lefty. And one of the things in our homeschool is to take a less Eurocentric approach. That's all well and good for you as a parent to impose your point of view on the curriculum. However, that may also mean that your child may not be as exposed to other perspectives. So again, I think for a lot of parents, they're like, yeah, that is the whole point. But that, of course, leads to one of the main criticisms that critics of homeschooling have, which is that kids may not necessarily get such a well-rounded set of perspectives. So I think it's just something as parents we need to be aware of. Obviously, we're putting our own stamp on the curriculum, but I think it's a good idea to allow room for different perspectives that don't only mimic our own. Okay, so if you want to learn the 5 non-religious reasons we decided to homeschool our kids, check out that video below. If you haven't already, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next video. And follow us on TikTok and Instagram at Homeschool Wherever. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.